The steel door of the high-end gym in Manhattan let out a soft click, a sound barely audible amid the rhythm of fists pounding heavy bags, the heavy breathing of professional athletes, and the glaring lights reflecting off beads of sweat. But just seconds after that girl walked in, all sounds came to a halt. Kesha Campbell said nothing, showed no signs of hesitation. She simply stood there with a worn sports bag slung over her shoulder, sneakers with thinning soles, and a face free of expression. Every pair of eyes in the gym turned toward her, not because they recognized her, but because she was the only black person in that room and looked like someone who did not belong in such an expensive, polished space. A young woman stepped forward from the corner of the gym, hair tied neatly, a muscular frame, and eyes that made no effort to hide their scorn. That was Victoria Sterling, two-time world boxing champion, known not just for her lethal hands, but for her sharp tongue and social media posts that attacked more than they inspired. Victoria walked toward Kesha with a half smile, speaking as if reciting a line rehearsed in front of a mirror for days. Well, look what we have here. Someone clearly got lost on the way to the community gym and wandered into the wrong building. Kesha said nothing. She met the taunt with a calm gaze, as if those insults were too dull to scratch the quiet strength that had been forged through years of weathering glances just like that. Her cracked phone screen still showed the correct address. She nodded gently and said, "I thought this was the Youth Scholarship Program." Victoria laughed, the kind of laugh that echoed like a stage cue. "A scholarship, sweetheart. This is not summer camp. This is where real athletes are made, not where social experiments happen." The words landed like a slap that needed no hand, and everyone in the room fell silent, not out of agreement, but because they were waiting to see how the skinny black girl would react to public humiliation. But Kesha did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She did not take a step back. She stood still, composed, as if this moment was just another chapter in a long book she had already read many times. Then, the office door opened and an older man stepped out holding a folder, eyes sharp like someone who had seen enough lives rise and fall to recognize what mattered. That was Tom Rodriguez, gym owner and a veteran trainer with over 30 years of experience shaping champions. The scholarship program still exists, he said firmly, and Kesha Campbell is on the list. Victoria snapped around her face cold, but her eyes betrayed frustration. "Really, Tom? Are you turning my gym into a charity? My sponsors are not going to like this." Tom stood his ground. "They pay for results, not your opinion on who gets to train here." It was never easy to cut through someone like Victoria, but Tom had long since gotten used to confronting oversized egos. Victoria was not finished. She walked closer to Kesha, smile turning into a quiet threat. "If you really want to be here, if you want to run with the big dogs, why don't we test whether you even deserve it?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew what was coming. A sparring match. No official referee, no prize, just 3 rounds between a champion and a girl nobody had heard of. If you last all 3 rounds, you stay. If not, get out and never come back. That was no offer. It was a trap, a public execution disguised as a challenge. Everyone saw that. Everyone expected Kesha to say no. But Kesha nodded. "I agree." Victoria blinked, not believing what she heard. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice dropping to the tone one might use on a child who does not understand how the world works. "Because when I am done with you, you are going to wonder if dreaming big was ever worth it." Kesha looked straight into her eyes and said, "I am sure." Then she smiled, a soft smile, almost invisible, but one that carried a message. no one could quite decipher. That was the moment everything began to change. No one in that gym that day knew they were about to witness something they would retell for years. No one realized that the girl did not come to learn, but to remind the world that true strength does not lie in muscles or medals. It lies in storms that carve the soul of someone who refuses to be dismissed. And the only person who sensed it in that very first instant was Tom Rodriguez. He looked into her eyes and felt a chill run down his spine, the kind of chill that only came when the instincts of an old trainer whispered that something extraordinary was standing right in front of him, hidden behind the fragile cover of quiet humility, and that something had a name, lightning. But for now, that name remained a secret waiting to be unleashed under the blinding lights of the ring. People saw Kesha Campbell walk into the gym like a misfit among a world of bright lights, the scent of leather gloves, and the sharp exhales of fighters mid-training. But no one knew what it took for her to reach that door. The long corridors of life she had to walk through, paths usually tread with calloused feet, and a faith slowly torn apart by the wind of poverty. 6 months earlier, Kesha had landed in the United States with a frayed suitcase and a slip of paper bearing the address of a rented room in the Bronx. Her family had spent 7 years saving for that flight, selling their last radio-skipping meals, just to gather enough for the visa and airfare. No one in her neighborhood believed she would make it that far, but then again, no one had ever really looked into the eyes of the little girl who once beat up 3 older boys for calling her mother a coward because she scrubbed dishes downtown for a living. Kesha did not cry when the plane left Kingston. She did not weep when her grandmother pressed a broken necklace into her hand and whispered, "Wherever you still keep your heart, that is home." But tears did fall silently when she arrived at her shared room, where the only fan barely spun, where there was no blanket, and the wall socket was loose, so charging her phone meant sitting by it to keep the plug in place. She worked the night shift, cleaning office buildings, mopping floors, collecting trash, scrubbing toilets, then napped briefly on the bus so she could make it to a morning kitchen shift at a family diner. She slept less than 4 hours a day, ate 1 proper meal every Sunday, and devoted the rest of her time to a single purpose, saving enough to apply for a sports scholarship program. She never told her family how hard it was. She did not mention the night she was thrown out because a drunk roommate got violent and she had to wait it out in a laundromat. She only said, "Everything is fine. I will send money home soon." Then one day, browsing through the list of gyms affiliated with the scholarship program, she found a name, Rodriguez Boxing Club, the same place that had produced 3 regional champions in the previous decade. Wearing worn-out shoes, holding her cracked phone and an acceptance letter, she walked to a door where people like her were never welcomed. But there was no pleading in her heart, because those raised in the slums of Kingston know that the ones who beg are the first to be crushed. The ones who walk in silence, at least, get noticed. And that was all she needed to be seen, without prejudice, without pity. Tom Rodriguez saw that. He had met strong people, had trained men with fists like steel hammers, but it had been a long time since he had seen a gaze like that, the look of someone not asking for help, only asking for a chance. While Victoria Sterling ridiculed Kesha with words sharp enough to make any other young girl break and leave, Kesha stood still like a tree before a storm, not bending, not trembling, just waiting for the wind to blow hard enough so she could show she would not be uprooted. Others saw a black girl in tattered sneakers and a wrinkled T-shirt, but Tom saw something far rarer hunger. Not hunger for food, but hunger for opportunity, hunger to prove oneself, hunger to be treated like a person with worth. So when Victoria laughed and issued her challenge, everyone in the gym assumed Kesha would decline, find a way out, salvage some dignity. But Kesha had nothing to salvage because nothing had ever been handed to her in the first place. She accepted without hesitation, as if agreeing to dinner without tension, without fear. Some people are born already knowing how to endure without bitterness. Others grow up counting each time they were dismissed, just so they can one day count backward the people who turned their backs on them. Kesha was that kind of person. While Victoria gleefully recorded Instagram stories ready to turn a sparring match into a spectacle, to boost her fading fame, Kesha walked into the locker room where a cracked mirror, a few old gloves, and a noisy ceiling fan awaited her. She did not look at herself in the mirror. She did not fix her hair. She simply put on the gloves and tightened the straps with quiet focus. Her eyes looked beyond the faded walls to a day when her fists would no longer be a means of defense, but a declaration that she refused to stay unseen. When Tom walked in and sat beside her, he asked just one question: "Why did you accept?" Kesha did not respond immediately. She sat in silence as if gathering forgotten memories. Then she said, "Because there are people who think being born in a better place gives them the right to mock those who crawl their way up from the mud. Because people like Victoria believe their laughter can drown out all the unseen efforts others have made. And I do not want anyone else to hear those words and have to walk away in silence." She pulled the strap on her gloves tighter, raised her head, and looked at him. "I did not come here to please anyone. I came to remind them that some things cannot be bought with titles, like dignity." And Tom did not need to ask anything else. Because in that moment he knew with certainty that even if Kesha never became a champion, she was already a living proof of something. The world was slowly forgetting that self-respect does not need to be loud, it just needs to be held tightly like a child cradling a dream on a rainy night. And in her hands, that dream had never once slipped. Victoria Sterling stood in the middle of the gym like she was on stage, and every spotlight in the world was meant for her. She recorded short stories on her phone, her voice smug and sharp, every word slicing into the pride of anyone who had ever been looked down on. She spoke about the lost girl from Jamaica, called Kesha a joke, a walking example of why humanitarian programs were a failure. Across the room, the bulky men fighters who had taken punches to stay upright lowered their gaze. They said nothing, but they knew something was off. They had seen confident people enter a ring and leave with faces bloodied, not because they lacked skill, but because their ego had blinded them to the traps laid beneath their feet. Kesha was different. She did not speak. She did not argue. She just quietly retied her shoelaces, adjusted the borrowed gloves until they fit tight. No one filmed her. No one cheered. No one thought she had a chance. But those who truly watched felt something stir. There was something in her posture, the stillness of water right before a storm, the eyes not filled with fear, but with a strange kind of waiting, as if she already knew what was coming and was simply being patient for her turn to speak. Tom Rodriguez was not a man easily swayed. In over 30 years in the game, he had seen every kind of fighter, from prodigies to brute force brawlers. But something in the way Kesha moved kept him from sitting still. He gently knocked on the locker room door and said, "Kesha, would you mind showing me a few moves just so I know what level you are at?" She nodded without a word, walked out to the trial zone where only a punching bag and a cracked mirror stood. Tom stayed silent as Kesha turned her steps soft like a cat stalking its prey. Then she threw a jab. Not fast, not flashy, just clean and precise enough to stop Tom in his tracks. He had never seen a jab like that from someone without formal training. Next came a three-punch combo, lead hand, rear hand, hip rotation, all executed as if pre-programmed. No wasted motion. Not a single breath out of place. The bag shook once, then settled. Tom swallowed hard, a chill creeping down his spine. Who taught you that he had to ask? But Kesha only shrugged. Depends how you define a teacher, she said, because I never had a real boxing class in my life. Then, as if to sweep away every remaining doubt, the gym door opened again. An older man walked in, short and stocky eyes, aged but not tired. Kesha froze the moment she saw him. Winston Campbell, her uncle, the man she thought she would never see in this place. He had once told her boxing belonged to an old life, a part of her she should leave behind along with empty stomachs and nights of staying awake in fear someone would break into their wooden shack. But today, he stood there. His eyes held no anger, only concern, like he knew she was about to step into something she once promised herself never to touch again. When Tom asked, "Do you two know each other?" Winston replied quietly, "I have known this girl since she was 8, and I can tell you that blonde girl on the other side of the ring has no idea what she is about to face." Tom pressed, "What makes you so sure?" Winston did not answer right away. He stepped back, pointed at Kesha's eyes, drifting far as if staring into dusty alleys of Kingston. That girl beat men twice her size. Not because she wanted to, because she had to. Lightning Campbell is not just a nickname, it is a warning. Those words sounded like prophecy. And while Victoria kept recording, kept mocking, kept laughing at torn shoes and simple warm-ups, a few seasoned fighters in the room began murmuring to each other. One man, Marcus, a former middleweight champ, looked at Kesha, then turned to his partner and said, "I have seen that kind of silence before. The quiet ones are always more dangerous." But Victoria heard nothing beyond her own voice. She spoke into her phone saying, "Just watch how I knock this amateur out in less than a round. The sponsors will see I am still queen of the ring." Kesha said nothing. But in her eyes a storm was rising, not to attack, but to wash away all the fake shine that clung to this ring. And when Tom saw Winston nod once more, he understood. This girl had not come here to ask for anything. She came to reclaim what had once been stolen in silence, once and for all. Victoria Sterling kept circling the ring like it belonged to her alone. Her blonde hair was tied high, her body dripping with sweat, but full of arrogance. She pointed her phone at herself and narrated the story of a Jamaican girl who dared step into a space meant for elite athletes. Her voice remained smug as ever. "You will not believe this. Someone thinks she can fight me just because she used to clean toilets down the block." She laughed loud and fake, then pointed at a corner of the gym where Kesha's old shoes lay quietly on the floor like a silent witness to the class division Victoria liked to uphold. Across the room, Winston Campbell watched his niece finish her warm-up. Every hip, twist, and breath measured and precise, as if Kesha heard none of the noise around her, but was tuned instead to the rhythm of her own pulse. Tom Rodriguez walked over to Winston, still not done wondering about the connection between them. He whispered, "You really think the girl can go up against a world champion?" Winston glanced at Tom and nodded slowly. "She did not come here to fight. He said she came to end something." Tom said nothing more. Some statements do not need explaining. They just settle in your gut like a quiet warning. And Tom's instinct, honed by decades in the ring, told him something unusual was about to unfold. Meanwhile, Victoria kept performing for her virtual crowd. She called her manager, spoke loud enough for everyone to hear Michael. "This thing is going viral. Relax, I will wrap it up fast. Won't even hurt her too bad." Her screen lit up with notifications, thousands, waiting to see how her story would end, and not one of them doubted Victoria would dominate. But Winston's eyes grew colder. He had seen girls like Victoria on the streets of Kingston, the kind who had strength but no depth, who believed being born into comfort gave them the right to step on others. He turned to Tom and said, "I taught Kesha that boxing is not a game. It is a test of dignity. Punches are not just technique. They are answers to society's invisible slaps." Tom nodded. He had begun to see that truth in every movement the young woman made. Kesha was showing something beyond a sparring match. She was packing her personal history, her pain, and her pride into every tightened glove. From another corner, some fighters sat down. A few who had laughed earlier now fell silent, not because they understood, but because their instincts forged in countless matches warned them they were about to witness something uncommon. As Winston spoke with Tom, Kesha walked over, sweat running down her forehead, her eyes landing softly on her uncle's face. "Uncle Winston, what story are you telling them?" Winston turned, a faint smile curling on his lips. Not the arrogant grin Victoria wore, but the smile of a man who had seen war reflected in a child's eyes. "Just told them you were the girl who made boys 3 years older keep their distance on that red dirt field. That lightning is not a nickname. It is a reminder." Kesha tilted her head slightly, half sighing, half wishing she could leave part of her past behind. "Uncle, I did not want anyone to know that. I do not want people to think I came here for revenge. I want them to see I have changed." Winston shook his head. "Change does not mean erasing your roots. You do not need to fight to prove someone wrong. You just need to exist fully so they dare not repeat their mistakes." Tom added, "I have never seen eyes like yours. There is something strange in them, not fear, not anger, but as if you already know how this ends." Kesha gave a soft laugh. "Maybe because I grew up spending every breath proving one thing, that I deserved not to be looked down on. I do not need to win for honor. I need to win so other girls can believe they too can step into places once locked to them." Winston touched her shoulder gently. His eyes rested on her face for a long while. Then he said, "Do not forget you are lightning. And lightning does not come to warn. It comes to remind the sky of its limits, but the heart of its boundlessness." On the other side, Victoria was still laughing. She had no idea the room had shifted. No one laughed anymore. No one pointed. Instead, a tense silence filled the air, the kind that comes before a storm, when no one knows if it will pass gently or rip apart everything in its path. When Tom stepped into the center, stopwatch in hand, he looked to both sides. On one stood a champion used to applause, living in spotlight. On the other stood a black girl who once had to fight just to earn a meal. And he knew this would not be a simple 3-round spar. This would be 3 heartbeats in which a society would face the truth that real strength never speaks until it is forced to. And in that moment, he chose to stand on the side of silence that meant more than 1,000 words. The moment the bell rang, what sounded like a simple chime turned into the kind of drum beat that marked a point of no return. Victoria Sterling stepped into the ring with the posture of someone already owning the win. Her chin was slightly raised, her eyes dripping with contempt like she was about to walk into a photo shoot instead of a real fight. She raised her hand to wave at the crowd, even though no one was really cheering, because what they were waiting for was not a familiar champion, but the possibility of something that had never happened before, something that would be spoken of long after this day had passed. On the other side, Kesha Campbell stepped onto the canvas, with no one filming her, no one clapping, no one chanting her name. She walked like the ring was not a stage for proving worth, but a place where truth is finally revealed. She did not wear the face of someone chasing glory, nor did she carry the fire of someone eager to become a legend. What she brought with her was silence, the kind that had followed her through years of being unseen, unheard, and unloved. And within that silence was something Victoria could never understand: the hunger. Not the hunger of an empty stomach, but the hunger of a soul that had been left behind for so long it no longer sought praise. It only needed to be acknowledged. Tom stood between the two fighters, his eyes scanning them both. Just before, he lowered his hand to start the match. He spoke in a voice only Kesha could hear. Do not rush to prove anything. Just be yourself. And she nodded so gently that it almost seemed invisible. But in that quiet nod, Tom felt something ancient and powerful begin to rise. As the first round opened, Victoria came charging like a storm. She launched the very moves that had built her reputation: lightning jabs, crushing crosses, and flawless circular footwork meant to trap her opponent into a corner. But what started to frustrate her was not a counterattack. It was the fact that her opponent was never there. Every punch she threw hit nothing but air. Kesha moved as though guided by breath itself, her feet barely grazing the floor, her entire body moving like she was following a melody that only she could hear. Victoria started shouting, telling her to stand still, but Kesha did not respond. She was not dodging because of fear. She simply refused to strike when the other person had not yet realized why she was there. She let Victoria throw punches into the void, let her waste breath and strength until her wrists began to ache, until her lungs screamed for air. And only then did Kesha strike. Her first punch was a left hook, not too fast, not too strong, but it landed clean and sharp enough to stop Victoria in her tracks. Not because of the pain, but because of the surprise. Victoria had never imagined someone with no formal training could land a blow with such precise timing, right when her balance failed and her guard was down. Victoria stumbled backward. Her face changed. No more smirking. No more biting words. For the first time, she realized she was being seen. And that was what terrified her. Not the punch itself, but the eyes in front of her eyes that carried a lifetime of rejection and never once bowed. She began to panic. Her movements grew sloppy, her punches desperate. Kesha answered with the same calm silence, never rushing, never forcing. Every strike she delivered was a memory carved in muscle, each one a chapter of a story she had never been allowed to tell. A hook to the ribs spoke of every time she was told boxing was not for women. A straight to the face was her answer to all those who laughed when she dared to dream from the back of a cleaning crew. And in the way she moved, there was something Victoria would never possess, no matter how many titles she won: a reason to fight. By the end of the first round, Victoria was gasping for breath. Kesha had not even broken a sweat. She walked back to her corner without reaching for water, without asking for help. Winston stood watching, his hand tightening around the chair, his eyes never leaving her. He knew this was just the beginning. And he also knew that Victoria was just now realizing this match had never been about strength. It was about the courage of someone who had always been underestimated before they even had a chance to speak. And when that courage stands up, no metal shines bright enough to compete. Because someone will always rise from the dark, not to steal the spotlight, but to remind the world that dignity is the one thing no one has the right to take. As the bell rang for the second round, the whole room held its breath. The air thickened like a fog you could not see but could feel closing in, and everyone sensed something was about to erupt. Victoria stepped out from her corner, her face flushed red, no longer wearing the mask of a champion. Her breathing was heavy, her legs had lost their rhythm, and her eyes could no longer hide the confusion. Inside her head, a question was forming and growing louder with every second. Who is this girl? On the opposite side, Kesha Campbell remained calm. She did not charge in nor step back. She simply moved forward like a silent wave, rising from the deep, steady, and sure. The people in the front row began leaning forward, eyes following every motion. No one was laughing anymore. No one was texting or posting pictures. They all knew they were about to witness something far beyond a sparring match. Winston Campbell clenched the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew lightning never struck the same place twice, but once it appears, no one forgets. Victoria tried to gather strength with a straight punch, but her arm moved slower than usual. Kesha tilted her head and slipped past it, like she was simply stepping out of the way of a raindrop. Then she countered not with force, but with precision. A strike landed right where it needed to, not to harm, but to make her point. Victoria stumbled, stepping back, and just then her eyes locked with Kesha's. There was no anger there, no pride. Only one thing that could chill anyone to the core, a cold and unwavering resolve. Victoria began to lash out wildly. She brought out every skill that had once won her glory, but this time her opponent was not just a name on the roster. Her opponent was the past of countless people who had been mocked, belittled, and discarded simply because they did not fit into the mold that society declared worthy. And you cannot defeat that with punches. Kesha moved faster now. Every blow was sharp, not fueled by rage, but by a near-clinical clarity. She was not fighting to retaliate. She was rewriting a story with her fists, each sentence clear, each punctuation deliberate. The crowd finally erupted after a flurry of strikes, a jab, a hook, then a crisp uppercut to the chin. Victoria collapsed like a crumbling tower, unable to brace, unable to understand what had just happened. Tom Rodriguez rushed in to count. Each number rang out like a bell tolling for arrogance. When he reached 10, the entire room exploded. Not because of a victory, but because a truth had just been declared. Kesha did not raise her fists. She did not turn to search for admiration. She just stood there, taking a long breath, like she had finally exhaled years of pressure that had sat heavy on her chest. She walked to the corner where Victoria was being tended to, knelt down, and with a steady voice said, "You once said you wanted to teach me a lesson. I hope you have learned that respect does not come from skin color or from nationality or from wealth. It comes from how we live and how we treat others." Victoria looked up at her, her eyes wet with bitterness. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she felt the smallness of the fortress she had built around her ego. In that moment, her phone buzzed endlessly. Her manager was calling, messages flooded in, sponsors pulling out, follower count dropping. mocking posts spreading like wildfire. But at the center of the room, under the brightest light, stood a girl with no titles who had just used grace to topple a name once bowed to around the world. Tom approached Kesha, his eyes full of belief, but also a trace of disbelief. He asked, "Why did you not tell me from the start who you were?" Kesha looked at him, her gaze still and deep. Because sometimes you have to let people dig their own hole before they can understand the depth of the mistake they have made. Winston stepped closer, wrapped his arms around his niece. He said nothing, just patted her back 3 times like a quiet salute. Kesha was no longer the lightning from underground fights in narrow alleys. She had become a woman who could stand in the center of a grand stage. Not for money, not for fame, but for every girl still waiting in the dark for someone to light the way. And today, she was that light. But perhaps what truly shook the room was not the win itself. It was that for the first time, they saw someone rise out of hardship without carrying hate, but with compassion. Someone who used strength to end humiliation, not to humiliate in return. And in the world of boxing, where fists often drown out voices today, a girl once called worthless used silence to make the world listen. After Victoria Sterling collapsed on the mat, the silence that followed was not disbelief. It was the weight of a truth everyone had tried to ignore. That not everyone who walks through the front door is the one most worthy to stand in the center. Kesha Campbell did not lift her head to seek applause. She did not turn back to look at the crowd now erupting as if they had just witnessed a miracle. She simply began to remove her gloves finger by finger, like someone peeling off a layer of the past that no longer needed to be displayed. Across the ring, Victoria was being helped up by her manager. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, like someone just waking from a dream where she was no longer the queen people once admired. Her phone kept vibrating. Messages rolled in like crashing waves. The winner was not her. And the image she had so carefully built no longer held up. A voice whispered from the crowd, soft but loud enough to echo through the room, "Who is she?" From a row near the door, Winston answered with a quiet smile, "Lightning Campbell." It was not a fancy nickname, but a reminder that some people are not born to be seen, but once they step into the light, they make it impossible to forget them. Victoria tried to stand, but her legs would not respond. She was not badly injured, but she had been defeated by something she never trained for. The kind of failure no one else could be blamed for. She looked toward Kesha no longer with contempt or pride, only with a silent sorrow. The sorrow of realizing that everything she once believed had crumbled in just a few short minutes. Kesha approached and gave a slight bow, a silent gesture of respect. She said nothing more. She had no lesson to teach, because sometimes the deepest lesson is the one we endure in silence. As she turned to leave the ring, Tom Rodriguez called out, "Lightning, can I ask you something?" Kesha paused and nodded. "Why did you never tell us who you used to be? Why did you not let anyone see what you could do from the start?" Kesha turned to him, her eyes unguarded. "Because if I had told them, they would only see me as someone special. But I did not come here to be the exception. I wanted them to understand that effort does not need to be decorated, it just needs to be respected." Tom said nothing. He knew he had just heard one of the truest answers in his entire career. Far in the back, Victoria's cameraman had stopped recording. The clips that were meant to highlight mockery had now become proof of a humiliating defeat. No one dared to post them. But social media does not forget. Clips filmed by random viewers scattered around the gym began to surface online. And within hours, millions had watched Victoria fall at the hands of a girl she had once mocked in front of the world. People were not just talking about the fight. They were talking about how Kesha held on to her dignity, how she never struck again when she could have, how she walked away from the cheers without needing to smile or raise her fists. That calm presence became the loudest statement. Winston walked beside his niece without saying a word. He stayed quiet as if speaking would cause everything to overflow, but then he stopped and gently touched her shoulder. "Do you know why they call you lightning?" Kesha looked at him as if hearing something she had heard 100 times before, but this time it meant something else. Because you do not fight to make them remember what you did. You fight to make sure they never forget how wrong they were. Kesha smiled, not the smile of someone who had just won, but the smile of someone who had just fulfilled a promise to herself. Across the city, in a newsroom office, a young editor stared at the footage and turned to a colleague. "Can we do a story about this girl?" The colleague hesitated, then nodded. "Let's call her the woman who made the world relearn respect." And while the name Kesha Campbell began to appear on headlines everywhere, she kept walking out of the gym. Her arms relaxed at her sides, her gaze fixed toward the light at the end of the alley. She did not know what waited ahead, but she knew one thing. From this moment on, anyone who stepped into a ring would think of her, not because she won, but because of how she did it. Without shouting, without stepping on others, without needing to prove anything, because some victories are not found in the final bell. They are found in how a person holds on to themselves through the noise of the world. And that day, Kesha held on to everything, not with fists, but with a stillness that weighed more than any declaration. 3 months after that historic afternoon, the light in the familiar gym still fell across the old mats and the swaying punching bags that danced to the rhythm of unfinished dreams, but something had shifted in the air. The walls now held new pictures, not of world champions who once trained there, but of Kesha Campbell helping Victoria Sterling to her feet, one woman bowing her head, the other reaching out her hand. Two faces, two halves of a world that needed to relearn how to treat each other. Since that match, Kesha's name had spread across every news channel, but not as someone who rose by tearing another down. She was known as the woman who made prejudice kneel. Social media exploded, brands lined up to offer sponsorships, and sportswear companies wanted to name entire product lines after the name Lightning. But when her new agent asked what kind of image she wanted to build, Kesha simply replied, "I do not need to build anything, I just want to be myself." While Kesha was being celebrated in a small apartment by the southern coast, Victoria Sterling lived quietly in the shadows. The house that once glowed with lights now held only an old sofa and a small television. Endorsements vanished, and the people who once surrounded her had gone silent. But perhaps the thing that hurt most was not the financial loss. It was having to sit in front of a mirror and not see a reason to hold her head high. In a rare appearance on a small podcast, Victoria's voice no longer carried pride. She said, "I was completely wrong. Wrong for believing I could not fall. Wrong for thinking someone's background defines their worth. And most of all, I was wrong for looking down on someone I should have been learning from." When the host asked, "If you could do it over, what would you do differently?" Victoria paused for a long time before answering, "I would learn how to listen instead of laugh." But the apology, late as it was, did not bring the public back. People had found their new hero. and she was left alone with carefully staged videos that had become relics of a shallow past. Meanwhile, in New York, Kesha launched Lightning Dreams, an organization dedicated to creating sports opportunities for young girls from underprivileged communities. She was not just the founder. She was the one teaching the basic movements, telling real stories from her life to inspire them. At the opening of the first training center in Kingston, the same place where she once lived, Kesha stood at the microphone in a simple white shirt with small letters that read, "Earned, not given." She said this story is not about revenge, not about glory, it is about dignity, about showing that respect does not come from applause, but from the way we choose to act, both when we are ignored and when we are praised. The room stood and clapped, not because the words were grand, but because they saw someone using her own wounds to bandage the dreams of others. But the moment that moved people most was not the free training or the scholarships. It was something quiet, something the press never reported. One day, Kesha visited Victoria, not to lecture or remind her of the past, but to hand her a small notebook. Inside was a list of youth centers that needed boxing coaches. She said, "Maybe your worth is not gone, maybe it just needs to be placed in the right hands." Victoria held the notebook, her eyes welling up. For the first time since her fall, she felt something lighten inside. Not because she was forgiven, but because someone still believed in her. And sometimes trust from the one who used to be your opponent is the final key that unlocks the door back to yourself. In her next fight, Kesha stepped into the ring officially as Lightning Campbell. That night, she finished her opponent in 2 rounds. But when asked about the victory, she said, "The hardest fight I ever had was the one with no scorecard, no cameras, no titles. Just one girl walking into a place she was not welcome and walking out with her self-respect still intact." Tom Rodriguez, hearing that, was silent. He knew he had not just witnessed a great athlete. He had seen a living reminder of what boxing once taught and what the modern world had forgotten, that the most beautiful punch is the one that carries no hatred. And sometimes the victory does not belong only to the last person standing, but to everyone who dares to face their own wrongs. That night, when the arena lights dimmed, people did not talk about Victoria as a loser. They spoke of her as an essential chapter in Kesha's journey, and that more than any title or belt was the greatest gift one person can offer another, the chance to change. The day Kesha Campbell signed her $2 million contract with Golden Gloves Promotions, she did not wear a gown, high heels, or pose for cameras like most athletes at flashy press conferences. She walked in wearing a plain gray hoodie, simple jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers. Her hair was tied neatly at the back, and her eyes carried the same quiet light that once hushed an entire gym in Manhattan. Her new agent asked if she wanted to say a few words. Kesha gave a small nod and said, "I am not here to flaunt a signature. I am here to make dreams feel normal for those who thought they were impossible." The room fell silent, not because of the statement itself, but because it sounded less like a declaration and more like a quiet vow. In her pro debut, Kesha knocked out her opponent in under 4 minutes with a counterpunch that sports magazines described as a moment where time nearly stood still. But instead of celebrating, she walked to her corner, removed her gloves, and sat down in silence as if what just happened was not a resounding victory, but merely one step on a longer journey. She did not need cheers. In her mind still echoed the silent hours of cleaning toilets at 3 a.m., the nights curled up on a cold Bronx floor, the mornings washing her hair with freezing water because the bills had gone unpaid. Those memories did not fall away like old skin. They stayed with her as real as breath, as constant as the tightening of her fists before every match. But maybe what made Kesha more than just a fighter was what she did outside the ring. She returned to Jamaica, not for honors, but to open the first Lightning Dreams gym right in the middle of the slums where she once grew up. On the opening day, heavy rain poured down, the dirt road turned to mud. Children huddled under the awning, their eyes lighting up when they saw Kesha step out of a truck loaded with gear. She carried each punching bag, each pair of gloves, each mat inside with her own hands. There were no cameras, no live streams, just her and a group of kids who had never learned how to name their dreams. In her first talk with them, Kesha did not speak of victories. She spoke of rejections, of doors slammed in her face, of being laughed at for wearing torn shoes in a fancy gym. Then she looked straight at them, no fancy words, and asked, "Do you believe you deserve to try?" A girl stood up skinny and quiet, much like Kesha once was, and said softly, "I think so." Kesha did not praise her or smile. She walked over and placed a pair of gloves in her hands. That was when people understood she was not there to teach boxing. She was there to revive the dying belief hidden in forgotten corners. Tom Rodriguez watched it all from afar. He had been invited but declined, wanting to give Kesha her own space. Instead, he sent a handwritten note with a single line. "Some are born to win, others are born to change what winning means. You are the second kind." Kesha folded that letter and kept it in her wallet, not as a keepsake, but as a compass. And as she continued her undefeated streak, people started calling her the uncrowned champion. She had never won a world title, but she was respected for holding on to something far greater than any belt, her dignity. In an interview with Sports Illustrated, when asked what motivated her, Kesha answered without hesitation, "I do not fight to win. I fight so that those who have never been seen can step into the light without fear." The quote was printed in bold on the cover. But when the editor sent the layout for her approval, Kesha had only one request: can you change the word light to path? When they asked why, she simply smiled and said, "Light is not enough. People need a way forward, not just a place to look at." And so the cover read, "I fight so that those who have never been seen can walk the path they once believed was not theirs." When she was nominated for Athlete of the Year, many expected a powerful speech. Instead, she stepped on stage and thanked her mother, Uncle Winston, and Tom. Then she paused for a long moment before saying, "I thank those who once laughed at me because they taught me how to hold myself together when no one else did." No applause followed immediately because the whole room was swallowing the lump in their throats. No one expected such a calm sentence to cut so deep, but that was Kesha Campbell's power. She did not need to shout to be heard. It was her stillness that made everyone stop and listen. And in that moment, people no longer saw her as the black girl once humiliated in a luxury gym. They saw a woman who turned hardship into light and light into a path for others to walk on. That night, when the final bell echoed across the ring in the unified world title match, every spotlight was cast on one single figure. Kesha Campbell stood in the center of the ring. Gloves still clenched her breath, still heavy, but her gaze was calm like the surface of a quiet lake. She did not leap up and cheer, did not raise her arms and circle the ring like many other fighters had done after historic wins. Instead, she walked over to the opponent who had just fallen, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and nodded a silent gesture of respect. A thank you for a match not driven by hostility but built on mutual dignity. The crowd fell still for a moment, caught off guard because they had just witnessed not only a perfect knockout, but a rare sense of grace where power did not come from fists, but from the way one holds themselves in victory. At the post-match press conference, everyone expected her to recall the hardships, to repeat the journey from slums to championship. But Kesha held the microphone with both hands, looked straight into the crowd where young, dark-skinned faces with bright eyes sat, and she said, "Today, I do not thank this title because it makes me great. I thank it because now thousands more believe that skin color does not decide who is worthy. Maybe I am the one walking away with the belt, but I am not the only one who won. Everyone who has ever been looked down on, laughed at, or rejected simply for not fitting into a standard today, they win too." The applause burst not for the victory, but for the message. In the dark corner, Tom Rodriguez lifted his hand to quietly wipe away a tear. He had trained champions, mentored countless talents, but none had ever made him feel this proud. Because Keisha did not just change her position, she changed the way people viewed an entire community. After the ceremony, Kesha returned directly to her hotel. No victory parties, no major media appearances. She sat on the balcony with a glass of water ice, gazing down at the shimmering city lights. Winston came and sat beside her without a word for a while. Then he asked, "Do you feel lighter now?" Kesha did not answer immediately. She let out a slow breath, her eyes still fixed on the quiet city below. A little lighter, maybe, but also a little emptier, because I know that tomorrow they will find someone new to celebrate, and these lights, they too will fade. Winston nodded. Yes, the lights will fade, but the path you opened will still remain. And then he told her that in Kingston now little girls were practicing boxing after school, not because they wanted to be famous, but because they wanted to be strong. That the Lightning Dreams gym now had 3 branches, and the waiting list was already full until next year. That every time a young girl stepped into the ring without fear of being mocked for where she came from, that was one more victory for Kesha, even if she was not there. Kesha bowed her head and stayed silent for a long time. Then she whispered, "You know, sometimes I wish I were still that janitor no one noticed. Because when no one sees you, you do not have to carry the weight of representing anything." Winston gave her shoulder a light squeeze, and that is exactly why you deserve it all. Not because you are perfect, but because you never forgot why you started. Kesha did not reply. She simply closed her eyes, letting the night breeze brush her face, letting memories of disdainful looks, cold stares, and nights curled up in cramped rooms return and slowly fade like breath in the air. A week later, she turned down every new sponsorship offer. Instead, she spent her time writing handwritten letters to every girl who had ever emailed her with the words, "I want to be like you." She did not respond with "keep trying." She told them about sitting in locker rooms, shaking before her first match, crying when people said she did not look like an athlete, nearly quitting from exhaustion. And she ended every letter the same way. "You do not need to be like me. You just need to never give up on yourself." 3 months later, Kesha returned to Kingston once more. Not to host an event, but to do something no one expected. She invited Victoria Sterling to co-teach a boxing session for young girls. When The program coordinator asked if she was sure. Kesha only said, if someone dares to change, we must dare to reach out first. Victoria arrived quiet and hesitant. But when she saw Kesha extend her hand first, she did not hesitate. Together, they taught every basic move, and in one shared moment, as they watched a little girl throw her first punch, they both smiled. No one said a word, but both of them knew sometimes forgiveness is not about whether the other person deserves it, but because you need to move forward with less weight on your shoulders. That night, Kesha quietly returned to her old gym in Manhattan. The room was silent, the soft yellow light casting shadows on the photos lining the wall. She walked up to the mirror where years ago she had seen herself in torn shoes. She looked long and hard, then smiled. No longer the girl who had been looked down on. No longer the nameless girl from Jamaica. Now, in that mirror stood someone who had walked through it all and still held on to her heart. And in a world that demands you to win just to be allowed to exist, Kesha Campbell proved that sometimes the greatest victory is not when you shout how strong you are, but when you walk through the storm with steady steps and a heart that never wavers.